now.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all of you out there, and welcome to our special Google Hangout today with Melanie Nutter, who's joining us today in San Francisco. My name is Gordon Feller, and I'm the moderator of the World Smart City Forum, and we encourage all of you to actively participate. You have a chat window in your Google frame on your screen in the lower right hand, and you can ask us questions throughout the program. We'll have a chance to hear Melanie's presentation, and then we'll transition to a question and answer period, which I'll moderate. We're getting help from Sylvia, who's based in London right now, and you may be hearing from her encouraging you to participate actively in this program. We will be posting this to YouTube immediately following the conclusion of our 1 hour together. This is our third Google Hangout in a series, and we've saved the best for springtime because we thought springtime, green shoots, green cities, smart cities, all those themes go together. So let me not delay much further, but I do want to encourage you, if you're shy and you want to ask your questions later or make comments during and you don't use the chat window, we have our Twitter feed at World Smart City, and that's the Twitter handle. You'll be able to track and monitor this via YouTube at the World Smart City website, and we encourage you to visit the forum and to participate in the discussions, worldsmartcity.org. This program is brought to you by the International Electrotechnical Commission in Geneva in partnership with the International Standards Organization and the International Telecommunications Union. So with that as our introduction, let me turn now to tell you a little bit about Melanie before she speaks and presents some of her ideas. She's the principal and founder of Nutter Consulting, which is a company that provides sustainability and smart city strategy development and implementation for clients. Those clients include cities, foundations, companies. She was formerly the director of the San Francisco City Government's Department of Environment, reporting to the mayor. And she was a deputy district director for Nancy Pelosi, who's the member in the U.S. House of Representatives representing the city of San Francisco and the District of Northern California. Nancy Pelosi, many of you know, is also the majority leader, currently the Democratic minority leader in the U.S. House of Representatives. Melanie founded the Energy and Environment Circle for the Full Circle Fund, and she's now the Chair Emeritus of that. And she's an active partner and participant in the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which brings 150 plus urban sustainability directors together from about as many cities around the United States and Canada. And she serves on the boards of the Meeting of the Minds and Urban Age Institute, as well as Ecodistricts. And we're really pleased to have you here, Melanie. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gordon, and thank you to the World Smart Cities Forum for inviting me to do this Google Hangout today. I hope what I'll bring is a unique perspective to the conversation around smart cities, where we will certainly be talking a bit about the technology, but also the strategies that it does take to get smart city capabilities up and running in U.S. cities as well as throughout the world. So very excited to be here today. What I did want to do is share the presentation that I have and go through a series of slides, and then I'm looking forward to the conversation with the community today. So let me get my presentation up and running here. So, as Gordon said, my background is in local and national government as well as in environmental nonprofits. And I really got interested in the whole smart cities movement when I was working with the city and county of San Francisco as their director of environment, because we really needed some smart city solutions and strategies. The reason that I say that is that San Francisco was awarded the greenest city in the U.S. By Siemens and the Economist Intelligence Unit back in 2011, and the city had really achieved that through a series of policies and programs and leadership to really advance environmental and sustainability initiatives at the local level. But looking at some of the challenges that the city still faces around economic equity as well as environmental protection, we knew that we had to look at new innovations and technologies and figure out a way to integrate those into sustainability planning at the local level. And that interest seemed to be replicated in cities around the U.S. who are also asking similar questions around how does data and technology advance sustainable cities. So that's really what I'd like to talk about today. So just to set the context, as some of you may know, urban populations will double globally by 2050, and the United Nations is projecting that 7 billion people will be living in cities by 2050. That's double today's population, and for the first time in human history, the number of people living in urban areas has surpassed the number living in rural areas. So we know that we are looking at rapid population growth in our world, and the pressure on our urban centers will increase. At the same time, cities are generating about 75% of the planet's carbon emissions currently. Many of these carbon emissions are coming from the transportation sector as well as from the built environment. Those are two of the largest emitting sectors. So we do know that cities currently are a central part of the problem but have to be part of the solution. Both greenhouse gas emission reductions as well as the population increases that our urban centers have seen and will continue to see around the world are impacting our natural resources, whether it's our fresh water supplies, our farms and fisheries, or our energy resources. And they're also putting a lot of pressure on our city infrastructure and our city assets, again, whether it's our transportation systems, our open spaces and parklands, or our housing. Here in San Francisco, we are seeing our housing impacted quite a bit by the increase in population in our city. But while we are seeing these challenges for our cities and our urban communities, at the same time, this community knows better than anybody the rapid expansion of innovation and technology that is currently taking place, whether it is the proliferation of big data, the increase in mobile cell phone use or broadband access. One astounding statistic is there are almost as many cell phone subscriptions, that's 6.8 billion today, as there are people on Earth. And this increase in utilizing this personal technology has just taken 20 years. So putting these three pieces together, the population growth in our cities, greenhouse gas emission reductions, and the rapid expansion of innovation and technology led us to ask the question around, can innovation and technology be one potential solution to helping our urban centers continue to thrive and be more sustainable for the citizens who live there? And through the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which Gordon mentioned, we did some research and found a report that is by the Global E-Sustainability Initiative and Boston Consulting Group that made this connection and showed that ICT does have the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 9.1 gigatons in the next 5 years. This is the kind of statistic that actually made city sustainability directors sit up and listen, where they may not have in the past wanted to know much about technology and data. This sort of potential for helping to achieve sustainability goals is what has driven some of the smart and sustainability work at the local level. So as I was mentioning, I wanted to talk about two reports that I've worked on through the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. The first one is a report that we created called the Getting Smart About Smart Cities Resource Guide. This is a resource guide that we created 2 years ago with about 11 U.S. cities looking at the connection between new technologies and big data with advancing sustainability goals. This was really a first-of-its-kind primer on accelerating innovation and understanding it for non-technical city staff. And this report has been published and is on the Urban Sustainability Directors Network site. It categorizes a number of strategies that cities need to undertake to implement smart cities work at the local level. And through this report, we did come up with this definition. We compiled about 14 or 15 different definitions that are being looked at worldwide around what is a smart and sustainable solution, and came up with this definition, a working definition to help us coordinate around what this is. So the definition is, these solutions use advanced information and communication technology to collect, communicate, and analyze data to improve the design and operations of a city's core systems, infrastructure and programs, as well as citizen engagement for greater efficiency and effectiveness, improving the city's sustainability, resilience, bottom line, and quality of life. And the one important element of this smart and sustainable city solution definition is it directly connects the use of this technology to the outcomes that cities are working to achieve. And this is one of the trends that we've really seen in smart and sustainable solutions, is they're not really being done for the technology in and of itself. It's the technology as a means to an end to achieving the city's goals. So on that note, this is part of the evolution that we have seen in the smart city space, where about 4 or 5 years ago, when smart cities, the term smart cities was getting more prominent around the world, there was really an understanding, at least by municipal staff, that this was something that was really driven by the private sector. It was really about a top-down approach for partnering with a private sector company to gather data, utilize technology to be able to achieve some of those city outcomes that we've been talking about. But it really was a top-down approach. And this is an example of the city of Rio that has created a smart city command center, which is certainly one part of the smart cities picture. But the evolution of the smart city space has really now put the citizen at the center. And this is critical for sustainability outcomes. When you're talking to a policymaker, whether it's a mayor or the head of an agency, the bottom line is those policymakers and municipal leaders are really doing their work and executing their jobs for the benefit of the citizens that live in those communities. So we're seeing more and more that this Smart Cities 2.0 certainly has the top-down, technology center-driven approach, but really puts the citizen at the center as well. So the core of the rest of the presentation is around a second report that we just published 2 weeks ago, which is a Sustainable Technologies Framework and Tech Guide, Smart Cities for Sustainability by, again, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, the Institute for Sustainable Communities, and Nutter Consulting. This is a report that was also funded by the USDN Smart Cities Innovation Fund grant, and it takes the conversation for municipal sustainability directors and other non-technical staff that one step further. And what it does is it looks at a framework for technology interventions in key sustainability sectors, particularly civic engagement, buildings and energy, transportation and waste, and the guide also has a tech review that looks very specifically at projects, providers, applications, and case studies in each sector. What I wanted to do with the rest of the time today is pull out just a few examples from the report to go a little bit deeper into how smart and sustainable cities are continuing to evolve. So on the civic engagement piece, I already talked about the 1.0 versus 2.0 concept of smart cities, and this is something, this is a framework where we looked at what a lower engagement 1.0 city means versus a 2.0. As an example, in a 1.0 smart city, the city really sees the resident as the constituent. They're sort of on the receiving end of the services, the technology, the applications that are being developed. In the second, Smart City 2.0 engagement, the resident is really seen as a co-creator. They attend hackathons, they interact very directly with the city. There's an ongoing back and forth dialogue where the resident feels some agency and ownership in some of the smart city solutions that are being created. Instead of it being top-down planning, it's very much interactive and collaborative, again, with the citizens, businesses, and stakeholders in a community. Instead of it being function first, again, it's really about putting the people first. And then also, instead of it being service delivery, where it's that one-way communication from the city, there's service innovation and service integration. So now I wanted to go into the 3 sectors that we cover in the report. The first one I wanted to touch on is building and energy grid systems. And this is really where I wanted to touch on the technology interventions and data interventions that we're seeing in these sectors. And I'm really curious to hear from the community as well once I finish the report about other technology or data interventions that you all may be seeing. But to start, for buildings and energy systems, to give you some context, energy use in the U.S. accounts for 31% of our greenhouse gas emissions. That is a figure from 2013. So this is, of course, a sector that we need to address to reduce our carbon emissions. And that sort of statistic is very similar globally. And we created this building and energy framework. We wanted to make the case for why technology integration can help to advance sustainability goals, to be a companion to any of the policies or programs or other types of initiatives that are at the local level. How can technology make a difference? And these are the three main sustainability goals that relate very directly to the integration of technology and data in buildings and energy. First is the goal is to integrate renewable energy into the energy grid supply. Second is to create a resilient grid that sheds load and integrates renewables. Third is to enable net zero energy buildings and energy end uses. And here, these are two sections in the tech guide where we focus particularly on smarter buildings. We pulled out customer engagement and demand response as two ways that technology and data are impacting the building sector. I'm going to give a couple of examples, but for instance, we're talking about building portfolio management, heat maps, efficiency targets, peak load shedding, dynamic utility rates, and smart appliances. Again, these are all very specific practical applications for technologies in the building sector. This is just one very specific example from the city of San Francisco that takes this down to the street level. The city of San Francisco has something called the Building Disclosure Ordinance, where all commercial buildings that are 25,000 square feet and over need to report their energy use to the city on an annual basis. And the idea is really to inspire property managers and property owners to actively gather and manage and process this information for their building, submit it to the city, and then the city is able to know what buildings do need further energy efficiency upgrades or renewable integration. This is an example of a company called City Zenith that is currently working with the city of San Francisco to develop essentially a heat map to show the green buildings that are more energy efficient, the red buildings which are energy hogs, as a way to utilize data and make it actionable for policymakers as well as for the public and for the property managers. Of course, the use of ICT is essential through the building management systems and for delivering this data to the city. Another thing I wanted to mention is the Smart Grid Tech Guide components. There's two pieces I wanted to pull out here. The applications are renewable energy distribution and storage, and then energy distribution. We have the specific applications within those two categories are solar and wind mapping, crowdsourced and community solar investments, smart grid network platforms, and predictive analytics. And again, being from San Francisco, I wanted to use another example that falls into those categories, which is around the solar and wind mapping. San Francisco a few years ago did create something called the sfenergymap.org, and it essentially shows all of the buildings in San Francisco and what their solar or wind potential is. And again, this is a way for gathering the data and distributing it out to the public so that it can be actionable. A number of communities have taken this example and created very similar maps to show, again, the wind and solar potential to help reduce carbon emissions in a city like San Francisco. So the next sector I wanted to talk about is transportation. I neglected to mention before the infographics that I'm showing here are part of the report, and they're really designed to take the entire smart cities picture to the sector level and show where some of these interventions are happening. So as you can see on this particular slide here, some of the ways where technology and data are interacting with transportation are, of course, through parking applications, smart street lights, smart energy and management in vehicles, data-driven transit, and a key portion is enabling shared mobility. This is the transportation framework that we created for the guide. These are the 3 sustainability goals that technology and data help to advance within the transportation sector: enabling shared mobility for decreased vehicle miles traveled, adopting a complete street policy that addresses all user needs, and plan for smart energy management. And again, these goals relate very directly to many transportation agencies' goals, especially in the US. And in the Transportation Tech Guide, we have segmented it down into these particular categories where you can find specific applications, providers, case studies, and examples on how technology and data are impacting these sectors, whether it's bike sharing, ride sharing, payment applications, parking, or fleet management. We've researched all of these areas and provided cities very specific examples about how to proceed and who to partner with. A couple of specific examples from the city of San Francisco: the electric vehicle charging infrastructure that the city put in place. It has been around for about 3 years, and the city invested in creating 180 electric vehicle charging stations throughout the city of San Francisco, both to get people out of their fossil fuel powered vehicles, but also to set up an infrastructure where that may actually be integrated into energy storage in the future. And one case study I wanted to mention that we talk about in the guide is Car2Go in Seattle, which is, at a glance, you'll see a couple of the statistics down here. It was launched in 2012, and it's really these smaller vehicles that you can access throughout the city of Seattle. They do cover about 83 square miles, and Car2Go has a per-minute pricing plus taxes and fee structure. But these are the kinds of vehicle programs that are being set up throughout the U.S. as well as throughout the world that enables people to basically get rid of their vehicles and to inspire being able to take transportation and other modes without having to own a personal vehicle. So this is just one company that's doing this kind of work, and of course having smartphones and ICT and technology and the data to do this allows people to access these vehicles throughout the city through their phone. And this is one other transportation related example from the city of San Francisco. This is an example that's been shared quite a bit in smart city circles called SF Park, which is an on-the-phone application where you can find parking spaces as well as pricing. And the environmental connection here is there's a statistic that says that about 30% of traffic in San Francisco and carbon emissions from vehicles in San Francisco comes from idling and also encircling, looking for parking spaces. So this kind of application actually does have a direct correlation to carbon emission reductions by helping people very quickly find a parking space and then also be able to pay on their phone. So the last sector I wanted to talk about is the waste sector. San Francisco is a city that has been an innovator in the waste sector. About 10 years ago, the city did set up a goal to become a zero waste city by 2020, and right now is reducing its waste by about 80%. And we are working very quickly to get towards that 100% by 2020. But in order to get from that 80% to 100%, all of the policies and programs needed some additional tools, and this is really where some of these waste technologies and data systems come in. This infographic is available in the guide and shows some of the interventions in the waste system. The waste framework and tech guide is combined, and these are the different elements that we review. The first piece is around avoiding the bin. So again, utilizing the sharing economy, being able to, even before something's thrown out, find somebody else who might be able to use your vehicle or some other item. The second piece is engagement and awareness applications. The third is around curbside pickup and route optimization. The fourth is looking at new sorting technologies, and the last is around energy recovery technologies. And just two examples to share. San Francisco and a number of other communities in the Bay Area created something called RecycleWear, which is just an on-the-web, very easy to access, as well as on your phone, database of where you can dispose of anything. So by being able to go on your phone, go on your computer, and type in anything that you want to get rid of, you get very specific information about how to dispose of it above and beyond the curbside programs that operate in San Francisco and other cities. And so those are the sectors, and those are some of the examples that I wanted to share, as well as the framework that I wanted to pose to this community. Just a few other thoughts to share before we open it up for a conversation. Some of you may have seen this. This is a maturity model by an entity called IDC Government Insights, and it's really their way of describing the process that cities are going through to become an optimized smart city. A lot of cities do like looking at this model and really understanding what the phases are, because since utilizing technology and data is still so new in many cities, it's hard to see what the steps are to get to that optimized point. So in the US, many cities are at the ad hoc opportunistic phase. Things are still very siloed, focused on tactical service delivery, not quite integrated yet, but you can see the process that cities will go through to become a more optimized smart city. And this is really the trends that we're seeing. Most of the pilots that are happening, whether it's in the waste sector, the energy and building sector, or the transportation sector, there are more and more pilots that will then, of course, be compiled into best practices, which we know will help with accelerating smart city technology. Cities are now developing internal expertise, bringing in a lot of the technology expertise in-house and starting to develop integrated smart city strategies. And finally, the more companies that are offering outcome-driven, open API solutions and helping cities account for planned obsolescence, putting these best practices, the commitment from cities and their strategies, and companies that are matching those needs together will help to continue to accelerate the smart and sustainable cities movement. And of course, all of this is in service of the goals that cities have set for themselves, whether it's being more data-driven, more equitable, more efficient, or low carbon. And that is my presentation, and look forward to hearing the questions from the group.
Melanie, thank you so much. This is a lot of material for us to go through. We have a half hour remaining, and I'll remind everybody that you can use your chat function to ask us your questions. We can also see some of your questions on the Twitter feed, which I'm following. We are going to post these slides, in case you're wondering where they can be found, not only on the YouTube presentation that will be posted shortly, because we're recording everything now, but we'll also be able to post those slides independently. And you just need to go to worldsmartcity.org, and you'll see the online forum, and you'll see details about our July 13 event in Singapore, but especially you'll see the announcement about this YouTube. So first question comes from Seville, Spain. And we have a question here, which I won't read the entire question, but Emiliano Mesa, who's in a master's degree program on smart cities in Seville, really just asked a question about whether technology and the discussion about technology is taking up too much space in the debate about the challenges that lie ahead for a smart city. And I guess coming back to your presentation about the 2.0 agenda, what's the balance, Melanie, that you think has to be struck between technology innovation that will enable the sustainable and smart city to become more visible and more effective, and the non-technology part of the agenda? How would you like to see the balance struck for cities that you're working with?
Sure. So I think that the challenge for a number of years is that the conversation really was just around the technology in and of itself. And so the conversation started and ended with what is the technology, what is the application, how do you integrate it? It wasn't outcome driven, and that is really the change that we're seeing. Is the question isn't only about what the technology is what can the technology do for the city and do for the citizens, and are there proven metrics to show that it will have that kind of impact? So that's one really important evolution, I think, of the smart cities dialogue within cities. And in terms of the right balance, we always say that smart cities is not the silver bullet. You cannot ignore policies, programs, leadership, all of the other elements that are critical for achieving these goals in cities. Technology is one additional tactical tool that cities have to use. When it becomes the only conversation, that's dangerous and that's a challenge. When it becomes integrated into a discussion around how to achieve outcomes and goals, then it's an additive tool.
Well, that is really helpful, because in this discussion that's taking place on the World Smart Cities Forum, we're debating some of the themes that are going to be front and center on July 13 in Singapore. And this whole question of tools that will enable city leaders, whether they're elected leaders or appointed leaders, or maybe they're private sector leaders that are working to help improve the city that they're operating in. The question of tools, some of which are technological, some of which are social innovations, and not just technological innovations. One of the tool sets that we're going to be discussing, I think, quite intensely in Singapore in July are measuring tools. How do we measure our performance, and can we find common open standards for not only the technology to interact with each other, but for measuring apples to apples, so the city of wherever can measure itself against a whole group of cities that are trying to dramatically change the way they transform their transportation systems. Mm-hmm. Can you say something about where you think we are in the search for good measuring sticks and open standards?
So I would agree that that is essential. Again, in the past few years, some of the movement has really been around the app is created or the project gets launched, and then everyone says we're done. That's great. That was the end goal, was to get something launched in a city, rather than actually going toward what are the measurements, what are the metrics, how do we prove that this actually does have value within the city. So I would say that is essential. That's an essential movement. In terms of metrics and standards, I mean, the ISO has been doing some incredible work on looking at what are some metrics and standards for cities in particular, and my understanding is that at the World Smart Cities Forum there will be some discussion around what has been created over the past year, what are some of those potential standards for cities, or what is even a framework for thinking about smart cities metrics. I don't know those off the top of my head, but I know that there's some great discussion around that.
Yes, and we'll be coming back to this next month during our Google Hangout with one of the executives from Électricité de France, and he, I think, is going to bring a lot of insight, because he's been involved for many years in helping not only to develop the common standards that we take for granted in the electrical universe. You know, we all take for granted that there are 220 and 110 outlets, and that our devices, whatever kind of device, consumer devices, industrial devices, will all be able to use the same electricity in ways that don't damage our precious consumer or industrial products. But he's also now helping to guide the discussion about where do we take the conversation as we look at smart cities and the kind of common solutions that they need that are interoperable, that are transferable between cities, so that technology companies that want to provide solutions can do that in a way that is not only relevant to a single city, but maybe even one day relevant to all cities. So that's something great. That we'll have next week. I'm sorry, next month.
That's great. So one other thought is I'm right now working with an entity called Star Communities, which is based in the U.S., and essentially they are a certification system for cities that are doing sustainability work. And they talk about sustainability broadly. It's environmental indicators, equity indicators, economic indicators, and they have a process for collecting existing data and metrics from cities in order for them to be rated as a Star community. And there is an interesting discussion right now going on within Star Communities around how to utilize that data either in this way for performance metrics in particular, as well as for cities being able to compare themselves among other cities to see who's doing what well here, who needs help, how to partner and pair some of those cities where they either have strengths or challenges. So that's one other way to think about kind of these performance metrics, and an entity that's actively looking into it.
This this brings us to a question that was asked a few minutes ago by one of our participants who's online. What cities in the U.S. can you point to that are useful examples which other cities can follow, maybe in the U.S. or maybe globally they can be followed, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? And the second part of the question is, are there models that are applicable to all cities, or do we need to develop solutions separately, city by city?
So I'll answer the first question with the caveat that the cities that pop into my head first, it's not an exclusive list. There are a lot of cities that are doing great work, so I'll just name a few. And again, this is not, it doesn't include all of them, but a few of the cities that are doing some really interesting work, I would definitely point to the city of New York. Through their Office of Innovation, they are working on right now creating a really interesting marketplace where they will be brokering the interactions with the corporate sector as well as with their community. So they're doing a lot of work trying to engage their community in what sort of smart city solutions they want to see, and then bringing that into a digital marketplace where companies will be able to bid on and offer solutions in an organized way with the city. So every single interaction is not a one-off. So they're really creating that as a potential model for how public and private sector can interact. And it's more general. It's not only around sustainability, but that could be a potential model. I would say the city of San Diego is doing some really interesting work around smart streetlights. They're creating what they hope will be a checklist that can be used for any city to go through the process of evaluating their assets, the cost, the benefit, whether it's part of the LED streetlights or other things that you can do with sensors that they're putting on their streetlights. Not only are they piloting smart streetlights at the local level, but do want to create essentially a replicable model for getting smart streetlight projects up and running. I would say the city and county of San Francisco is doing some really interesting work. They are a finalist right now for the Department of Transportation Smart City Challenge, and that hasn't been launched yet, but they're one of the finalists at doing a shared mobility integrated project. I would actually direct the entire group to the Envision America cities. So Envision America, for those who don't know, is a relatively new network that was started out of the White House U.S. Smart Cities Week in September, and it launched in January and essentially brought together 10 U.S. cities that had very specific projects where they wanted to bring them to the private sector and then have the private sector offer ideas about how to implement them. And they were smart streetlight projects. Some of them were more of these template kind of projects. Some were really around microgrids and ecodistricts. So there's some really interesting examples of on-the-ground project work that's happening through Envision America. The city of San Francisco, or the city of Chicago, and their array of things. I could go on and on. I think that there's some really interesting work happening in the U.S. I would say, though, the challenge that the U.S. currently has is some other countries do have national funding and national dollars that are going to support local initiatives. I think the European Commission and European Union is an excellent example where they have offered national dollars to invest in getting deployment going at the local level around smart cities. So I think the U.S. right now, unfortunately, is a little bit siloed because there isn't that sort of national movement. The Department of Transportation Challenge is one exception and one really great example, I think, of where the U.S. might head. But for right now, a lot of U.S. cities are collaborating through these networks, whether it's Envision America or another type of network. So hope that helps. Those are a few examples, but there's certainly plenty of others.
It does help quite a bit. And back to San Francisco's energy map, since it raises a question, I don't think a lot of other cities have used the same technology that San Francisco developed for its energy map, and I wonder why. Why are cities not doing more to essentially exchange knowledge, and maybe to the point, why isn't that exchange of knowledge where it happens resulting in a situation, let's say, where San Francisco energy map is now being used by other cities, the same template, the same form? Why would somebody not want to use the SF energy map, and why hasn't it become a standard for cities around the world?
So that's a great question. I personally do think that it is an excellent template. It's an excellent template to use. Um, Not to simplify the answer to the question too much, but part of it is around concerted focus and attention for promoting that it is a solution to other cities. Again, right now, it's very much a catch as catch can. Did an energy manager at another city happen to stumble upon the map and find it and think that it was interesting and proactively reach out to the city of San Francisco to find out how to partner? There isn't really a system for taking those best practices and elevating them in a way where they can then be shared. That's why I do think a lot of these networks are really essential right now for sharing those best practices. There's no technical reason that that kind of template could be used, except for that there, as some folks know, a lot of challenges for getting energy data and information at the local level, and each city is different. And so that would be one technical challenge for how to deploy something like a solar map. But as a framework and a best practice, I certainly think it is something that could be replicated.
And one question has come in, which is, of course, the corollary to the question about which U.S. cities would you recommend looking at as potential role models? What EU cities, what cities in the European Union stand out in your mind? You may not be doing a lot of work in Europe, but are there any that stand out in your mind as being exceptional stories that we should look at more closely?
So I'll just mention a few cities that I hear about a lot. I would certainly say the city of London. I would say Birmingham. I would say Milton Keyes in England. I would say Helsinki. Certainly Amsterdam. Certainly Barcelona, which are stellar examples of how they have utilized data and technology throughout the city and really embraced the smart cities concept. But there are a lot of really great examples, and again, through the European Commission, who have funded a lot of cities to deploy. I'm sure that there is a list. I don't have the entire list available, but those are just a few that come to mind that are doing some really interesting work. Milton Keyes in particular is doing really interesting work around shared mobility and integrating shared mobility with their transportation system.
And on shared mobility, since the July 13 program in Singapore is going to be built around mobility and transport and energy and water and cybersecurity, those four themes, is there something happening in shared mobility that you think has relevancy in other areas, like you talked about waste and you talked about energy? Is there a lesson that can be learned with the advances that are rapidly being made in mobility that perhaps have a useful story to tell or a useful principle to share with the other sectors that we've been discussing, that maybe shared mobility is out in front for whatever reasons?
Mm-hmm. You know, the thing that really comes to mind is a lot of cities are grappling with a couple of very specific elements of the shared mobility movement. One is how the shared mobility companies are interacting with the government and with transportation systems. There are a number of cities where shared mobility companies have sort of come onto the scene, started operating, and in some cases were operating in a silo, and that has caused certainly some conflicts between the traditional transportation system and the investments that need to be made there to continue to have a robust transportation option. But how you integrate a shared mobility system that is innovative and new into a legacy system is a big question for a lot of U.S. cities. And that's not to say that there aren't best practices out there, but and that's actually one thing that I'm studying with another client right now. But what are those best practices? What are those policies? What are those enabling policies? What are the collaboration platforms for cities and the shared mobility companies to come to the table and say, how do we have a shared mobility solution that works for citizens, works for the companies from an economic standpoint, and works for the government from their transportation standpoint? So I would say that's one issue. The second issue is around payment systems. There's a lot of questions about equity and access and who is actually able to use some of the shared mobility companies, because they are banked versus unbanked. They have smartphones that are able to access some of the apps. Whereas there are residents in cities, some that are not able to utilize those services currently because of those barriers. And so that's another question. Again, it relates more to the policy aspects and the way to change some of those technological systems or set up new policies or programs. But I would say it's really around collaboration between the public and private sector and the payment systems, and how to open that up and enable more people to access shared mobility services.
And on this P3 question, on the question of public-private partnerships, can you say the one thing that you think is the most important barrier to overcoming the obstacles that stand in the way of public-private partnerships? Is there one key item that you would put your finger on that has to be present in order for those to succeed and come into being?
That's a great question. For public-private partnerships in the smart city space, and particularly in the sustainability space, I think there's a few elements that I think are critical to success. One is, where possible, having a neutral third party that helps to bring the public and private sector together, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's an incubator, whether it's an entity that's been set up jointly by the city and companies. Having that kind of neutral ground for conversations to happen and for that exchange to happen is one thing that I've seen has been really successful in cities. So how to find those third-party, neutral party conveners to bring the right parties together. The second is an alignment of outcomes and goals and funding. That is obviously another critical component. And a third component, I think, is performance and metrics and success. Cities have a lot of challenge with taking on new risks, with managing failures, even if they're pilot projects. So when public-private partnerships are being brought together, being able to have performance metrics and demonstration, especially for the cities, to show that something will either be a pilot, and so that failure and risk is managed, or there's an opportunity for success. I think that's a third component.
Questions come in, and it says the following. Is it the funding and the innovation only that define these success stories that you talked about within the US and the European Union? Or are there some other factors that might be even more important than the funding and the actual innovation that's being developed? What stands out, in other words, in those success stories that you listed for US or Europe that you would put your finger on? Because the person is asking, is it the funding and the innovation, or is it something else?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, it depends on what the goal of the particular project is, to be able to say whether it was funded and launched. Is that considered the success? Is it that the pilot project or the project is run for a certain length of time? Is it that there are these measurable outcomes, whether it's carbon emission reduction or vehicle miles traveled that are measured, that can be pointed to for success? I would say when you're looking at sustainability in particular, having those hard metrics for performance and outcome are really essential. And you can measure them. Again, when you're looking at transportation, how many vehicles have been retired? How many vehicles are now electric vehicles? How many people are deciding to get out of their cars and either take public transportation or take a shared mobility vehicle? Are you able to point to a specific building that has reduced its energy use by a particular percentage? Those are hard metrics that can be pointed to as success stories. As you look at sustainability, though, it also is, there's an equity component and an economic component. Has it generated jobs? Has it created an economic engine within a city? Has it provided more access to a particular community in some way? So I would say there's both measurable and immeasurable ways to point to success for some of these projects. It's still somewhat at the high level, and I think we could talk very specifically about certain projects, but in general, I would say there's both.
Well, and you put your finger maybe on something which I think we haven't called it out yet, but what's the role of the citizen engagement? You talked about some citizen engagement innovations in your presentation. Maybe one of those citizen engagement strategies is to ask, what is the measure of success for our community? We have this smart city project. It may be shared mobility, it may be smart grid, it may be whatever, and we want to know from the public at large, what do you consider to be the key success ingredient that has to be present for us to consider a job well done?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is, it goes back to the 2.0 around the citizen engagement, rather than the city putting out the RFP, making the decision, that being created sort of without citizen engagement. I think that's a critical component, is what does the community see as success for that investment?
Well, we've been working you hard, so we have 10 minutes left, and we have one tough question, which, you know, you always save the really tough ones for last when you've exhausted the presenter, but here it goes. Can you think of any example of projects where standardization played an important role in the success for that city?
I think that it's still too early to tell. At least from the projects that I am aware of and familiar with, standardization has not really been integrated in a formulaic way for a lot of these projects. So I know that through the work that some of the work that I did with ISO as well, some of the work that ISO is still doing is trying to figure out what is the value of standardization for these projects. What do cities need that? Do they want that? And how will that drive either additional smart cities work or more successful projects? I would love to hear, Gordon, if you know of ones that projects where standardization really was essential, or if the community does. I know that there's some interest in trying to find those projects. I don't know any off the top of my head.
Well, one I think that would be worth putting on the list to consider is Barcelona's approach to using Internet Protocol as the common standard by which all data was developed and transferred and accessed by either citizens or city managers for multiple projects in the waste area, in the outdoor lighting area, in the parking area, in the smart water meter area. The idea was, we don't want to use any other standards beyond Internet Protocol. It's now become the common global open standard. It's a success story. There's trillions of dollars of transactions that are enabled by the use of Internet Protocol. And so the former mayor of Barcelona, Mayor Trias, decided that this would be, you know, a fundamental ingredient to all of the different projects they did, and it cut across all of them, whether it was energy or water or transport or waste. And it was one of the key ingredients for success. Now, the new mayor has decided she doesn't want to continue with a lot of those projects. Some of them have been continued by the utility anyway, like Aguas Barcelona, the water company, the water utility of Barcelona, saw so much in the way of real savings as a result of this that they didn't want to abandon it, even if the politicians decided after they changed chairs that one wouldn't continue for the other. Speaking of politicians, maybe the last question, and you can opine about the situation in the United States with the presidential. When Madam President takes office on January 21, and she announces, you know, her program, how obviously smart cities is not at the top of her priority. Hillary Clinton hasn't talked about this on the campaign trail because it's not a political priority in the United States right now. But could you project ahead a few years? Is there an area like transport for cities or energy for cities or waste streams for cities or water for cities where you think it's going to emerge that enough cities and enough critical mass will develop that the President of the United States will make it a national policy that investments in smart city become a priority? Is that even in the cards as you see it?
Well, first of all, before we get to that question, the one other city that, when you were talking about Barcelona, that came to mind in terms of standardization and just sort of thinking about the city as a platform is the city of Santander, Spain, has done some really interesting work with, again, setting up sort of that standard platform for how they would bring pilot projects into their smart cities work. So I just wanted to mention that as another interesting example. In terms of getting national support for smart cities here in the U.S., Unfortunately, it is a continuing political calculation. Whether or not that will rise to the top as a funding priority in the next 3 to 5 years certainly remains to be seen. I do feel, though, that with the White House announcing its support last year for Smart Cities work, and particularly supporting a Smart Cities Week in Washington, D.C., as well as for now that going to the agency level where the Department of Transportation did put out the Smart Cities Challenge, that seems to me to indicate at least a movement and an awareness at the national level that may gain in momentum. There's a lot of factors at play of who will be in power and whether it's the president or the House of Representatives or the Senate, and whether that becomes a funding priority. It's hard to tell. Absent national funding, it will need to continue to come from the grassroots, where cities will need to find it within their municipal budgets, find ways to innovate with companies where it makes financial sense for cities to move forward with some of these initiatives, and hopefully also work within some of these networks to be able to share best practices and possibly identify either joint procurement, even as one other idea. So it's hard to say. I would love to see it at the national level. Hard to say whether that's actually going to materialize.
One request has been made. The reports that you featured, USDN reports, are they available on the USDN website is the question.
Yes, they're both available on the USDN website. It's under Innovation Products, and both links are available to both reports. If for some reason you have any challenges finding them, you can email me at melanie@nutterconsulting.net, and I'm happy to send them to you as well.
All right, and a final question: how can cities enact the behavioral? I'm quoting in literally what the questioner asked. How can cities enact the behavioral changes necessary for many of these programs to work, i.e., giving up private car ownership? Any thoughts there?
Well, this is a great question, one that's close to my heart, having done a lot of engagement and outreach work with communities. I do think that it starts with both offline and online outreach strategies. Part of it is that, like many citizens in cities, people are really busy and it's hard to get their attention to show them what the options are for making changes. So I think part of it is around the outreach and education that both cities and companies can do just to even make people aware of what the options are. That's number one. I think number two is anytime there's an opportunity to create financial incentives, that often works. We saw that with the Zero Waste program in the city and county of San Francisco, where the way that the waste rates were tiered, you could actually save money on your garbage bill by recycling and composting more. So it was essentially incentivizing the right behavior by utilizing a financial incentive. So anytime there's an opportunity to use financial incentives, that's another way to do it. And then just, of course, reducing the barrier, making it easy. And that may seem obvious, but again, when you're competing with family individuals that don't have a lot of attention span, how can you make it easy and financially beneficial for people to change their behavior? It's hard, it takes a lot of money and time, but it's certainly worth it.
Spoken like a mother who tries to alter her children's behavior. I think you have practice in this area, obviously.
Yes.
Well, look, this has been a fantastic hour. Thank you for taking the time out of a busy Monday. We hope you have a great week. We are seeing, Twitter comments, which you'll see when you have a chance to check in with Twitter. This was really our best so far, and that's not a surprise. And we really think that you have your finger on the pulse here in a way that we want to be able to stay in tune with the pulse of this throughout the next few months leading up to our July 13 program. For those who didn't hear earlier, Melanie is based in San Francisco and she runs Nutter Consulting, and you can find her on the web at Nutter Consulting. You can find Meeting of the Minds, where she's a member of the board, at cityminded.org. We encourage you to come to worldsmartcity.org to look at what the discussion about all of these themes is like over the coming months leading to July 13 in Singapore. And with that, Melanie, I'll say to everybody, you'll be on YouTube, and your kids and your grandkids will see this session for decades, if not centuries. So thank you again.
Great. And thank you, Gordon, and thank you so much to the community for listening in and for all the great questions. And again, Gordon, thank you for the invitation to participate, and look forward to more discussions on the World Smart Cities Forum community.
Thank you. Good night to everybody.
Thank you.